It's a pleasure. I'm happy to be here talking about the work, and I hope it interests you and that you have, I'm happy to hear your questions and thoughts on the research. What I want to do is maybe give an overview of some of the work that we've done in our lab on the topic of race and police shootings, including some analyses of real-world data from police shooting events in the United States, and also some experimental laboratory data if we have time as well. Okay. And where we're going to end up getting to, hopefully at the end of this, is a general theme that the nature of fatal police shootings is often misunderstood in many people's minds, and that finding evidence for racial bias in officers' decisions to shoot is actually a much more complicated thing than it might appear on the surface. Okay? And at the same time, also where we're going to end up is that there are some things that we just don't know. We don't have good enough data for, and we are, in some questions, in a state of uncertainty. And we have to just be comfortable with being in a state of unknown uncertainty for a while. Okay? So when we think about police shootings, at least in the United States, most of us think of a number of widely publicized and really well-known, highly tragic cases that have happened in the U.S. Okay? If you're of a certain age, probably roughly my age or older, one of the first people that might come to mind is Amadou Diallo, who was shot by the NYPD, unarmed African immigrant who was reaching for his wallet and was shot in the late 90s. More recently, more in the modern, or in the last 10 to 15 year era, is Michael Brown, of course, Ferguson, Missouri, also unarmed when shot, and a few years ago, Philando Castile, okay, who was shot in Minnesota, again, during a traffic stop, was reaching for his wallet, and the officer shot and killed him. Okay. Much of the discussion around fatal police shootings concerns cases like this, okay? Really high profile, extraordinarily tragic, heartbreaking cases of fatal shootings in the US. What goes along with that is often the assumption that these are the common kind of fatal police shooting, okay? That, in other words, that these are representative of what fatal police shootings really look like. So we can ask the question of what do we know about the roughly 1,000 or so US citizens who are shot and killed by the police each year. Okay. What do we know about the circumstances surrounding those shootings, and what do we know about the role of racial bias or of an individual's race on the likelihood that that person was shot? Okay. It turns out that up until a few years ago, we actually weren't able to answer these kinds of questions in any kind of comprehensive nationwide level. Okay. That's because prior to 2015, in case you didn't know, there were no complete databases of fatal police shootings. That's because in an almost unbelievable condition here in the US, police departments are not required by law to report fatal police shootings to the federal government. Okay? So when a police department has a fatal shooting of a citizen, they're encouraged to report, but they're under no technical obligation to report that to the federal government. And so people had suspected that federal databases of fatal police shootings were undercounts of actual shootings, but no one really had any hard data on just how bad those federal databases were. In 2015, news organizations like the Washington Post and the Guardian, pictured here, did some reporting and developed public databases of all fatal police shootings in the US. And so they did investigative journalism. They had citizens contact them when there was a shooting in their city, and they went out and gathered information about that and compiled all of those in one place. Okay. They're a little bit different from one another. The two databases aren't exactly the same, but they are, as far as we know, the most comprehensive and complete databases of fatal police shootings. And it turned out we could now look and ask, how much were police departments underreporting in the US? And it turned out they were underreporting by about 50%. Okay, so at the federal level, we only knew of about half of all of the actual shootings that had occurred in the US. Right? There's some rumoring that the reason why, or one of the major reasons why that was the case, was that the three major cities in the US, particularly Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, all had an unspoken agreement that they wouldn't fully report because they didn't know which was worse. None of them wanted to be #1 in this statistic, so they all just simply failed to report. And that's a large number of shootings from the database. But it's not all of them. So it was the case that many departments, perhaps most departments, were underreporting the police shootings that they were having. Okay. So that is an incredible statistic. It's still not the case that they're forced to. They're working on new legislation to get this, but this is really one of the most embarrassing aspects of United States federal law enforcement policy. Okay. So now that we have these more complete databases, we can look to them and try to answer some questions about the nature of fatal police shootings. Okay. By way of getting to some answers, it's a day of technical problems. That's fine, I can use the computer here. By way of getting to some answers, we want to first keep something in mind, okay, when we try to ask the question about fatal police shootings, so that we get some clarity about what exactly we are and what exactly we aren't able to answer. Okay? So one important point is that the process that leads from initial contact between a police officer and a citizen to the end point of a fatal shooting is a very complicated, dynamic, oftentimes volatile, very uncertain process. Okay, and this makes the topic a bit difficult to study. Okay, it is not a straightforward movement from initial contact to shooting, and it's not a straightforward series of events, even from one shooting to the next. Okay, and so we have to appreciate some of the uncertainty that's part of this. Okay, if we think about, some kind of hypothetical police-citizen interaction. Okay. There's some initial contact that gets made between the officers and the citizens. Sometimes that's discretionary, where the police officer might make the decision to stop someone because they look like a suspect or they think they're doing something suspicious or whatever. Other times it's non-discretionary. Okay. So the officers might be responding to a 911 call. They don't have a choice to do that. Okay. They're compelled to do that. Okay. So there can be discretionary, there can be non-discretionary initial contacts. Right. Once that initial contact is made, though, there's some interaction that begins, okay, some ongoing interaction that's going to unfold over time, right? It might be initial information gathering on the part of the officer. Okay? During that interaction, many different things can occur. You could imagine that at some point the officer is going to make the decision to pat down the citizen that they're talking with. Okay, for whatever reason, we don't always have insight into that decision. Okay? But there's some complicated process, some complicated interaction going with a number of different decision steps along the way. Okay? Sometimes it ends there, and that's the end of the police-citizen interaction. Okay? Other times, as it unfolds, it can branch off. You could think about the many different ways that interaction could branch off and follow different paths. Okay? Just give you a couple of examples from recent, some police shootings and some not police shootings. Okay? Recently in New York, an individual was stopped. He was part of the group of citizens who it was a highly publicized event of dumping water on some police officers. He was stopped for a different reason. The police officers were talking with him. It was not, I wouldn't describe it as a friendly interaction, okay, but it wasn't an overtly combative interaction either. When they went to cuff him, then he took off running, okay. Now this ended up, he was, grabbed and handcuffed, and that was the end of it, okay. In a different case, this is a still from body cam image of a shooting from Salt Lake City a couple years ago. An officer was called on a 911 call, got dispatched that there was a gun in a convenience store. He showed up, he tried to talk with this, I believe it was a 19-year-old. Again, not overly combative, but the officer told him to put his hands up because he thought he was the one with the handgun. The citizen told him no and reached for his waistband, and the officer shot him, thinking that he was going for a gun that was tucked into his waistband. It turned out he was unarmed. Okay, so again, an initial contact that went in a very different direction. One was more combative, one was a less combative event. Okay? In Chicago last year, this was an event where, again, officers stopped a citizen that he was a suspect, that they were for, I believe, a murder. Actually, the interaction again was going very well until they went to pat him down, and then they discovered he had a gun on his hip. He then became combative and ran. When he ran, he got stopped by a car, spun around, grabbed his hip, and the officers shot him. Okay? In that case, he didn't grab his gun, but he had his hand where his gun was, and the officers knew that he was armed. Okay? And sometimes you get much clearer cases, such as this case where, again, a citizen was stopped. He had a gun, ran from the officers, had the gun out, and turned around to face the officers, and he also was shot. Okay? So if you think about that series of events, okay, that long, complex, just highly variable set of events leading from initial contact to a possible shooting, we really want to appreciate just the complexity that's involved there, okay? And no two shootings are going to be exactly alike, right? Within this, what we also want to keep in mind, and this is often hard to remember, is that there are really two parties in any one of these interactions, okay? And each of those parties can influence the way in which that interaction unfolds at any of these points, right? And so we have the officer, and we care a lot about the officer, and we typically study the officer and focus on the officer, but there's also the citizen, right? Both of them together are coming together in this interaction and influencing how it unfolds. Not all officers are the same. Some are more authoritarian than others. Some are more combative and disrespectful than others. Not all citizens are the same. Okay, some are more combative and disrespectful than others, okay, or more or less compliant than others. Okay? Each of those at any point can impact how this interaction carries out. Okay? So within all of this, okay, sorry, before I move on. And also the other thing to keep in mind is that if we do find evidence of racial bias, let's say on the part of police officers at one stage, it doesn't mean there's racial bias at every one of these stages, okay? And if we don't find it at one stage, it doesn't mean that there isn't some somewhere else, okay? So an officer might be racially biased, let's say, in terms of the quality of the interaction that they have with the citizen, where maybe they're more disrespectful, say, toward minority than non-minority citizens, okay? They might show racial bias there and not in some other step, okay? So we're going to try as we move through some of the data to answer a number of these steps, okay? But where we're going to start with is that decision to use deadly force, okay? The endpoint decision here, in the moment where the officer has to make a decision to fire his or her gun or not, okay? What do we know about that decision and the role that race might play in it? Okay. And when we ask about racial bias, what we really mean is the question that was a famous question that was raised a number of decades ago of whether officers have, quote, one trigger finger for blacks and a separate trigger finger for whites. Okay. In other words, is it the case that officers would not shoot people if they were white relative to if they were black? That's essentially the question of racial bias in that decision to shoot. Okay, so as I said, the major question that we have then is to try to understand race bias in that decision, okay, in the decision to use deadly force, and understand the degree to which it impacts police officers. Okay. You might think that's really not a question that needs to be asked because we all already know, in fact, that there's a racial disparity in who gets shot, and we already know that police officers are biased, and that's what accounts for that racial disparity in terms of citizen race and being fatally shot by the police. Well, what we want to do actually is look at what the evidence for that is and try to understand that evidence in a little bit more detail and see how solid that really might be. Okay. What we're going to conclude here at the end of this section is that understanding racial disparities, okay, understanding whether one group is shot more than we would expect relative to another group is always relative. Okay? We always have to have some standard or some comparison that we're dealing with. Okay? We're comparing the rate at which some group is shot relative to what. Okay? And that becomes a really key question in understanding racial disparities. Okay? So let's take a look at some numbers. Okay, these are fatal shooting data in the U.S. from 2015. We're going to restrict our numbers here just to black or white citizens, just for ease of analyzing the data. But we can look at other groups as well if you're interested in. We can talk about that at the end. Okay. And these are only fatal shootings. So as hard as it is to get data and learn something about fatal shootings, it's even harder to get to any data to learn something about non-fatal shootings. Okay, so only conclusions that we can draw really concern the case where a citizen is actually killed. We know almost nothing about when citizens aren't killed, but they are shot. Okay, and officers do not kill everybody that they shoot. Okay, there's a lot of shootings that occur that don't result in a fatality. We're just looking at fatal shootings here because those are the data that we have that we can look at. Okay. So in 2015, there were 261 black citizens in the U.S. who were shot fatally by the police. Okay, if you imagine each of the people up there is 100 people. Okay. And there were 526 white citizens who were shot by the police in 2015. Okay. So in terms of just a simple odds, right, based on those raw numbers, we would say that whites were twice as likely to be shot relative to blacks in the United States in 2015. Okay. Now, obviously, we all recognize right off the bat that that's not a particularly meaningful number. Okay, to know that whites were twice as likely, there's 526 versus 261, because of course there are more white citizens in the US than black citizens. Okay, so even if officers were showing a lot of racial bias, we would still expect more whites to be shot, just given that there's a larger pool of whites to draw from, okay, relative to black citizens in the US. So we need to do some kind of adjustment for that, right? In other words, we need to have some benchmark, right? To what do we benchmark those 261 and those 526 citizens shot? We have to have some comparison. Okay? And the way that this is typically done, the standard way to do this, is to adjust for or compare to overall population levels. Okay? That is a standard kind of comparison to look at disparities of really any kind, but especially racial disparities in the decision to shoot. Okay? And when we do that, what we're asking is, are black citizens or white citizens more likely to be shot given each group's overall population level? Okay? So given the overall number of black and white citizens in the US, right, benchmarked against that, are black or white citizens more likely to be fatally shot? Okay. That's really the question that we're asking when we benchmark against population values. Okay. So again, if we take those 261 and the 526 citizens, okay, we can benchmark that again against the, I'm not putting the exact numbers, roughly 40 million black citizens in the US and 200 million white citizens in the US. Okay. And we can ask, what are the odds that a person is shot if they're black or white, given the overall population values? Okay? And the way that we would do that, which is just a standard way, again, that every calculation would do that, is you would compute the odds of being shot if you're a black citizen relative to the odds that you're shot of being a white citizen, and divide one of the odds over the other. Okay? And that gives you an odds ratio that tells you that one group is X times as likely as another group to have something happen. Again, this is absolutely ubiquitous. If you were doing work on the odds of dying from a heart attack or something, you would do exactly this same sort of calculation. Okay? And so basically you could say you would take the 261 and compute the odds that a black citizen is going to be shot given the population of 40 million. That works out to 0.0000065. Okay, so you're looking at roughly 7 in a million. Okay? You do the same thing for whites, 526 out of 200 million. Again, you basically divide those two numbers, you get about 3 out of a million. Okay? And what you can see is that relative to each group's overall population, it's clear that black citizens are more likely to be shot. Okay? The odds are 2.5 times greater that a black citizen will be shot relative to white citizen. 7 million out versus 7 out of a million versus 3.5 out of a million. Okay, and that's the standard odds ratio. That's a well-known value. If you look at things like unarmed shootings, that number is even higher, something closer to 3.5 times more likely to be shot unarmed if you're a black citizen relative to if you're a white citizen. Okay, so when we say that one group is 2.5 times more likely to have some event, that's how we would calculate that. Okay. If you prefer, you could do the same thing in terms of percentages. Okay, you could say out of everybody who's shot by the police, fatally shot by the police, black citizens represent 23% of that group. okay, of that roughly 1,000 people or so. That's about 23% of that group. In the US population, black citizens are roughly 13%. There's a disparity, right? 13 is, we would expect 13%, and we get 23. So again, there's a disparity there. We can do the same thing with whites, and again, compute an odds ratio, okay, to give us roughly the same value there. Okay? Okay, so when we do that, the conclusion is absolutely clear. There's no question at all about this, that relative to the population values of each group or the population levels of each group, blacks are overrepresented in being fatally shot by the police, okay? And so we would state that as black citizens are 2.5 times likely to be shot compared to whites, given each group's overall number in the US population. Okay. Okay, and again, as I said, this is a just absolutely standard way of doing this kind of work. Anytime you're showing a per capita event, that you're basically doing the same thing as what I just showed you. Anytime, 2 per 100,000 or 2 per million, whatever it might be, comparing percentages, all of these cases are basically doing the same thing of calculating a ratio based on or benchmarked against some population value. Okay. Okay, but notice what we're saying when we make the statement that black citizens or any group would be 2.5 times more likely to be shot, okay, given their overall representation in the population. Okay. I said earlier that all calculations of this type are relative to some standard. There's always some comparison that we have to make and that we have to justify the particular comparison that we're using. Okay. Here, the benchmark, as we said, is population proportions. It's the 40 million and the 200 million citizens in the US broadly. Okay. When we use that, what we're saying is that we expect that group members should be shot at the same proportion that they exist in the general population. Okay? That's the implicit statement that we're making when we do this kind of comparison. And if we deviate from that expectation, then we say that there's a disparity, right? We expect that black citizens should be shot. It should be 13% of those shot because they're 13% of the population. We deviate from that, and so there's a disparity there. Okay? But what we want to ask, actually, and dig in a little deeper, is whether it's correct, in fact, and whether it's accurate to compare the proportion of a group's outcome to that group's overall representation in the population. Okay, is that actually the right benchmark for us to understand this outcome and to gain an understanding of racial bias in the decision to shoot? Okay, okay. Well, why might this be misleading? Let's take a couple non-shooting examples just to illustrate the general problem with this calculation. Okay. Imagine that there's a new cancer treatment out. Okay, it's the best cancer treatment that there is. It's the gold star for cancer treatment, and we want to research whether groups are receiving that treatment in a proportionate way. Okay, is there a disparity in who's receiving that treatment? Okay, so let's say we look at everybody who gets cancer treatment in a year, and we find that 13% of all of those people who got the best cancer treatment were black citizens. Okay, were black patients. Okay? So we look and we compare that to the 13% in the US population, right? By that metric or by that benchmark, we would say that there's not a disparity, right? Things look great here. Okay? Black citizens are 13% of the population, and they're also 13% of those receiving the top treatment. Everything looks fine. Okay? So by that benchmark, we would say that the world of cancer treatment does not show any disparities, any racial disparities. Okay? Imagine that we found out, for whatever reason it might be the case, we don't need to know the reason right now, but imagine that we found out that actually, although black citizens make up 13% of the US population, they actually make up 50% of cancer patients. Okay? Now, at this point, we would, I think, rightly conclude that there was a racial disparity here, okay? That black patients were not getting the top treatment in accordance with what is the appropriate benchmark, the people who have cancer. Okay? So in this case, it's quite clear that we would want to compare the proportion who got cancer treatment to the proportion who actually have cancer, not to the general US population. The general US population is irrelevant in this case, okay? Because the outcome isn't needed for everybody. Right? In this case, there's a very clear way in which that's true, which is that people generally don't elect to have cancer treatment if they don't have cancer. Okay, so we have a clear sense of who the appropriate pool is, and it's not the total U.S. population. Okay? Let's take another example, which is disparities, sex disparities in STEM. Okay, we can look at physics majors in undergraduate populations. Okay, let's look and see, as is the case, that females represent about 20% of physics majors. Okay, so we look at all physics majors. If we consider that to be the outcome, enrolling as a physics major, we find that women are only 20% of physics majors. Okay? We look to the U.S. population. Women are about 51% of the U.S. population. All right? That's a disparity. We have a clear disparity here. There's a 30% gap in terms of what we would expect to be true. Right? We should expect a 51% enrollment of women in physics, okay, or as physics majors. Okay? But in this case, actually, the disparity is much worse than that. Okay? And that's because women make up 70% of the undergraduate population. Okay? So again, the disparity is not a 30% disparity. The disparity is actually a 50% disparity. Okay? As we saw in the previous example, the relevant pool of individuals is not the U.S. population. It's people enrolled in college, okay? Because you have to be enrolled in college to be a physics major, right? So the U.S. population benchmark, as in the prior example, can be misleading, right? If the outcome is not equally available to everybody or equally relevant to everybody, then it's not always the case that the U.S. population level is the right benchmark. Okay. Here it's the undergraduate population. Okay. Both of these cases illustrate some potential pitfalls with choosing the U.S. population as the right benchmark. Okay. And they have a major assumption that's built in there, right? And that assumption is that members of different groups have equal opportunities for experiencing that outcome. Okay. In the case of cancer treatment, it's obvious that that's not true. Okay? Because only people with cancer elect to have cancer treatment. Okay? In the physics major, the same is true, because not everybody in the U.S. population is becoming a physics major. You have to be enrolled as an undergraduate. Okay? So the assumption there when we use that population benchmark is that members of different groups have that same opportunity. Okay? If we apply this logic to the case of fatal police shootings, right, when we benchmark shooting percentages or raw shooting numbers against the U.S. population, what we are saying, in fact, what's required for us to do that, is to say that members of different racial groups are in those situations where deadly force is relevant at rates that are proportionate to their overall population. Okay? Just as in the cancer and the STEM example, what that calculation requires is that if black citizens are 13% of the U.S. population, and if white citizens are 70% of the population, then it must be the case that if we look at all of those decisions, all those situations where deadly force is relevant for the officer, okay, where the officer is in the case of making a shoot or no shoot decision, that 13% of those individuals are black citizens and 70% are white. Okay? That has to be the case if we're going to look to the population proportions. Okay? So benchmarking, anytime you benchmark some number against the U.S. population, you are requiring that the experience of that or the opportunity for that event to occur happens in proportion to that group's overall representation. Okay? If it doesn't, as with the STEM and the cancer examples, you're going to get a misleading understanding of what the world is like. Okay? If it's the case that different groups occupy deadly force relevant decisions at different rates, okay, then the more appropriate benchmark is not the number of citizens in the general U.S. population. Okay, it's the number of citizens from each group who are in those deadly force situations. Okay, that's the appropriate benchmark if we want to know something about racial bias on the part of the police officer. And I'll give some examples here in a second of why that's actually important. Okay? If said differently, you can't experience a policing outcome without encountering the police. Okay? And so if members from different groups encounter the police at different rates, we have to take that into account. right? We can't just look at their overall population values. Otherwise, it's a misleading quantity. Okay. Okay. Given this, what we can do is ask whether police are likely to use deadly force in every single situation. Okay. If it's the case that police are likely to use deadly force as likely in one situation as another, then actually we're okay with using the population values, right? If it's the case that police are more likely to use deadly force in some situations than others, then that population value might be misleading, okay? And so we want to know, are there some situations for which deadly force is relevant for an officer and some for which it is not, okay? And it's very clear, and I'll show you the data on this, okay, that deadly force is not relevant for every single experience that a police officer has or every single kind of policing scenario for an officer. Okay? And that's because deadly force scenarios or situations are strongly, strongly tied to violent crime situations. Okay? So as a qualitative way of looking at this, we can actually look, I just started at 2015 at the database that we have now from The Guardian and went through the first 10 shootings of 2015. Okay, so let's take a look. I give you a quick summary of what those first 10 shootings are. The first shooting, there was a 911 call about a domestic disturbance, so that's non-discretionary. The police have to show up. The police show up to this house. The man here emerged from his house pointing his gun at police officers, and police officers shot and killed. The police officer who showed up shot and killed him. Okay? Second, we don't have a picture of this individual. Again, a 911 call came in. There was an armed man. Police showed up. The man threatened to shoot the officers, pointed his gun at them, refused to drop his gun, and the officers shot and killed him. Okay. Third case, police respond to a 911 call. Okay, there was a violent dispute, a violent domestic dispute. They showed up. The man was tased. Okay, he wasn't complying with the police orders, so he was tased. He reached for his waistband and was shot. In this case, he didn't have a gun on him. The officer thought he was reaching for a gun when he went for his waistband. This one is a still actually from the dash cam video of this event. A man was pulled over in a traffic stop at night. The officer thought he was acting really nervously. He got him out of the car, did a pat down. As he was patting him down, discovered a gun. The moment the officer discovered the gun, the guy became combative and tried to grab his gun, and the officer shot him while he was reaching for his gun. This one, again, there's no picture of this individual. A man pulled up to a restricted police lot, waited for the police to come to his car. When he did, he pulled out a gun and aimed it at the officers, and the officers shot him. This was a tragic case also of suicide by cop. We know this because he left a note in his car for the police officer who was going to eventually kill him, saying, "I'm sorry, I used you, I just want to die," and so on. Okay, and we can talk about that also. There's a surprisingly high number of those cases in the U.S. Okay. I think the number 6, man identified by the police as a robbery suspect. He was driving a stolen vehicle. They stopped him. They ID'd him as a robbery suspect. He then opened his door and started firing his gun at the police officers. Officers killed him. Okay. Police respond to a 911 call of a man armed with a gun, threatening bar patrons and assaulting his girlfriend. He was shot when he refused to drop his weapon. Okay. Again, 911 call, man threatening his son. The police show up. The man took out his gun and pointed it at officers, was shot and killed. Okay. Police were trying to carry out a warrant for this man. He was wanted for sexual assault of a teenage girl. He aimed his gun at the police officers and was shot. Okay. Finally, again, 911 call. Officers respond. The man here had a knife. He stabbed the police dog when they showed up with the dog, and then he raised his knife over his head and approached the officers, and the officers shot and killed him. Okay. The point about going through each of these cases is to illustrate that this is not a random sample of situations that everybody in the U.S. finds themselves in, okay? And it's not a random sample of what is relevant for everybody in the U.S., okay? These situations are, by and large, violent crime, okay? They involve violent crime. Right? And police training, as well as the legal justification for police to use deadly force, is tied to threats. Okay? They're tied to threats to the officer's life or another citizen's life. That's when police are justified in using deadly threat, okay? or deadly force. Okay? And so the question is not are black or white citizens more likely to be shot given their overall population proportions? It's, are black and white citizens more likely to be shot given their encounters with the police in these decision-relevant situations, okay? And the quantitative data back this up as well. So if you look at the data on, again, that now we can analyze, that we have these large, nearly complete databases, okay, what you see is that deadly force use, again, is strongly tied to physical threats from citizens. So somewhere between 85 and 90% of citizens who are fatally shot are actually armed at the time of being shot. Okay. Out of the roughly 800 black or white citizens, so again, about 1,000 of citizens are shot every year. There were 1,100 in 2015. Of those, about 800 are black or white citizens. If you look at those black or white citizens in the US who were fatally shot, only about 45 or so per year could be described or classified as being both unarmed and not aggressing against an officer at the time of being shot. Okay, so in the Philandro Castile case, for example, that would be one of those cases. Okay. In some of the smaller data sets that were analyzed prior to the 2015 years, 2015, 2016, those researchers were finding the same sorts of things. Roughly 90% of fatal shootings involved what was defined as a clear deadly threat. Again, someone has a gun, they're currently shooting at someone, so on and so forth. Okay. And so it is the case that when you analyze fatal police shootings, you do see that officers are overwhelmingly shot in crime-related situations, okay, and almost always shoot the person who is involved in criminal activity. Mistakes do happen, and we'll talk about those, but innocent bystanders being shot by the police is really quite rare. Okay, okay, so if police are more likely to use deadly force in violent crime-related situations, okay, where violent crime is currently happening or where they've showed up to a scene where it's suspected to have been happening, okay, if that's the case, then the question that we want to know, okay, if we're going to use the population proportion as a benchmark, is to know whether citizens from different groups are in those situations at the same rates. Okay, so is it the case that black and white citizens, and again, we could look at the full range of data. We have data on Hispanic and Asian citizens as well. Okay, but what we want to know, again, for the purposes of what we're analyzing, is it the case that black and white citizens are involved in violent crime situations to the same degree? Okay, and this is a very complicated. Let's just appreciate the complicated nature of why this is true. Okay, nobody's saying that there's a simple answer for why this is true or a simple solution for it. Okay, but it is very well known that people from different racial groups don't occupy violent crime situations at equal rates. Okay, and so the data are just enormously clear on this. There's no question at all about it if you look to the data. And we'll talk about police bias in arrests and reportings also in a little bit. Okay, but as just one example, you could look at the Centers for Disease Control data. Centers for Disease Control have nothing to do with police data. The police don't report the data to them. These are autopsy reports. Okay, and what we can do is look, because we know that over 90% of any death, if it's a murder or non-negligent manslaughter, is within race, we can get a pretty good understanding of who suspects are based on who victims are. Okay, and in 2015, for example, if you just look at all assaults, okay, and so these are raw numbers, in terms of all assaults, white citizens dying, again, almost always at the hands of another white citizen. There were 5,000 cases. For black citizens, again, dying at the hands of black citizens was almost 9,000 cases. Okay, in 2015. If you look at death by firearm discharge specifically, so all assaults is any kind of assault, if you look at just firearm deaths, those numbers are even more dramatically different, okay, 3,000 versus 7,500. And again, those are raw numbers, so when you actually look at a per capita rate, the difference in violent crime experience is massive for black and white citizens. Okay, there's a very strong difference. Again, this is victimization in terms of them being victimized, but because we know that almost all of the, or about 90% or so of the suspects in those cases are the same race, we can get a good sense of what the suspects are also. Okay, just to be clear, this is a really important point before we move on also, that the number of people who do things like commit murder is unbelievably low, okay? And so it's useful when we talk about crime and race to remind ourselves that almost everybody from every group is exactly the same, okay? It doesn't matter what your racial group is, you're not going to commit murder, right? And so if you look at this, this is arrest rates for black and white citizens, all right? 0.002 and 0.01% of black and white citizens are arrested for murder and non-negligent manslaughter. You can't see it, but this is actually a pie chart with that sliver cut out of it. Okay, that's how small of a group that is, right? The number of people who would commit murder is unbelievably low. Black and white citizens are the same. 99, above 99% of them. Okay, we're all the same, right? But there is a difference. There is a probabilistic difference, okay? And that difference is bigger when, it's a larger slice of the pie when we look at violent crime in general rather than just murder, but there is an important difference there, okay? Okay, we'll skip this slide and move on to this, okay? So as we said then, because black and white citizens are not involved in violent crime at the same rates, okay, in terms of being in line with their population levels, this is going to make the population benchmark misleading, okay? It's like looking at all people instead of cancer patients, right? We want the group of people for whom the outcome is actually relevant, okay? And so the more informative question is actually, are black or white citizens overrepresented in fatal police shootings given each group's involvement in violent crime, because that's when fatal police shootings happen, okay? Or said differently, given the rates at which black and white citizens are exposed to the police, okay, in those situations, because remember, you can't experience a policing outcome without being exposed to the police, okay, then is it the case that officers are more likely to shoot black citizens, okay? Now, the problem with this, of course, is we don't know any group's racial or any group's crime rate in reality, okay? The true crime rate is unknown of any group, okay? What we can do is try to look at as many different pieces of data as possible and then see whether they're all telling us the same answer, okay? And so what I'm going to show you is some data. There are more data here, and I'll explain them as we get it. But what we can do to look at exposure first is we can look at the FBI's two different FBI sources. And again, we'll look at non-policing sources in a moment. Okay, but we can look at the FBI's summary report system data, okay, on murder, non-negligent manslaughter rates, right, or numbers for both arrests and reports of those events. Violent crime arrests. Violent crime includes murder, non-negligent manslaughter, rape, robbery, and assault, okay? And also weapons violations, okay? Who's carrying a gun illegally, right? And again, this is being arrested for that, right? We can also look at the National Incident-Based Reporting System, also from the FBI, and look at, again, murder, non-negligent manslaughter, violent crime, and weapons violations. So these are overlapping but somewhat distinct data sets of crime, okay? And what we can do then is ask, what are the odds that a black or a white citizen is shot given their rates of violent crime of that group? Okay, so again, instead of saying given the population proportion, what do we know given the rate at which different members of different groups would encounter the police in those situations where the police might use deadly force, okay, or for which deadly force would be relevant, okay? And so these are all just listed here. The first panel is benchmarking off of homicide data. Okay, what you're going to see is on the y-axis is the odds ratio. Sorry, the pointer's not working, and I'm not tall. The odds ratio 1 would mean that there's an equal likelihood of a black or a white citizen being shot. Okay, numbers below mean black citizens would be more likely. Numbers above would mean white citizens would be more likely. Okay, so again, where we saw before on the population level, a 2.5 odds, black citizens being 2.5 times more likely to be shot, that would be down here. The bar would be low, below 1, okay? Well, when we benchmark and set it on homicide data, actually that effect goes away, okay? And indeed, it flips to the other side, where black citizens are not more likely to be shot than white citizens, given each group's involvement in homicide, okay? We can do the same thing benchmarking on violent crime in general, and there's a number of different calculations of violent crime that you can do. They're all up there so you can see them. What you could see is in no case do you see, again, evidence of anti-black disparity in police shootings once you account for violent crime rates. Okay? And again, the same is true when we look at weapons violation data. So that, again, this is asking, given the rates at which black and white citizens are arrested for or are reported carrying illegal weapons, okay, we again don't see anti-black disparity in fatal police shootings. Okay. Now, an obvious problem here is if the data themselves are biased, okay, then that might mask any actual bias on the part of the police. So if it's just the case that police are more likely to, let's say, pat down and arrest black citizens relative to white citizens, then the whole thing is wrong because there's going to be bias already built into the data, okay? And that would mask anti-black disparities on the part of the police making deadly force decisions. What we can do to account for that is to look at two additional sources of data, okay? One, as I said, is the CDC death data. Okay, so these are data from the Centers for Disease Control on whether people have died in death by assault. Okay. Those are not subject to police bias, right? So we know that these are, as much as we can, a quote pure count of homicide rates for black and white citizens. We can also look at the National Victimization Survey. Sorry, I blanked on what it stood for there for a second. The National Victimization Survey, okay, is a nationwide representative survey. It's a telephone survey. People are called up every year and asked, were you victimized by somebody in the last year? If so, tell us about it. Okay, so again, that's a self-report. If you were robbed, you would tell the person on the phone, yeah, I was robbed by a male in the middle of the night, and so on. Okay, so again, these are not contaminated by police data, okay, or police bias. And what we see when we do that, again, is little to no evidence for anti-black disparities in being shot by the police. The CDC death data look like all the other homicide data. The National Crime Victimization Survey data are right there on no bias, which is, again, the odds ratio of 1. And same with the reports of having a weapon used against you. When we benchmark on that, again, it looks at 1. Okay. Now, these are, as you can see at the top there, it says all fatal shootings. These are all cases where anyone was fatally shot by the police, right? What we want to do, though, is ask, is it the case that maybe if police aren't biased in all shootings, okay, maybe they're biased when it comes to things like a misidentification of a wallet for a gun, okay? Or in cases where it's more ambiguous, right? Perhaps when someone has a gun out and they're firing it at the officer, they're going to get shot no matter what the race is. But in those ambiguous cases, maybe that's where we see bias, okay? And so we can do that first by looking at cases where someone is killed when they're unarmed and they're not physically attacking an officer. Those would be more ambiguous cases. There's 100 of those across the 2-year period. And now what you see, okay, is that there's a little bit more evidence for anti-black bias, okay, anti-black disparities. Some of those numbers are starting to go below 1. And what you also see is those bars, the lines above and below the odds ratios get very big, okay? And we'll talk about that in just a second. When we look at those cases where someone is killed while they are holding or reaching for an object, they're reaching for their waistband or they take out their wallet and it's mistaken for a gun. Again, those are 45 over the 2-year period that we analyzed here. Again, you start to see a little bit of potential anti-black disparity, but now those measures of uncertainty are huge, okay? And what that's going to do is that's going to reflect the fact that once we start to ask about these more specific questions, there just isn't a lot of data there, okay? We really don't know the answer of whether police are racially biased when it comes to identifying a gun and they mistake a wallet for a gun because there are just so few cases of that. So at this level, we have to just be in a place of uncertainty where we say, we don't really know whether there's racial bias on the part of the police. It might be the case, it looks like there might be some evidence for that, but there's just so much uncertainty in what we can know. Okay? That's not true for all the shootings. When we look at all the shootings, we have a lot of data there. We know what the answer is. It doesn't look like there's racial disparities or racial bias on the part of police. Okay? Once we get to this level, we're just at a place of uncertainty. Okay? So if we summarize that, we ask, are black or white citizens overrepresented in fatal police shootings, not given their population levels, but given their involvement in violent crime? Overall, and by overall I mean when we look at all the shootings from 2015 and 2016, okay, which is about 1,500 shootings total, it does not look like there's anti-black disparity in those shootings. Okay? What this means actually is that even if it was the case that officers were completely blind to citizen race, okay, even if they somehow couldn't know what a citizen's race was, we are still going to see a population level disparity. Okay? There's still going to be a population level disparity with black citizens being more likely to be shot given their population values because of the greater exposure to crime. Okay? Once we get into specific types of shootings of unarmed citizens, the data are just too uncertain. Okay? We just don't have an answer to that question right now. Okay? And I know generally people don't like uncertainty and don't like to be left with uncertainty, but that really is the state of where those data are when we look at how uncertain the estimates are of those odds. Okay? Because the data are consistent when we look at the CDC data, for example, it's unlikely that initial contact bias has a lot to do with those numbers, okay? So we're doing another analysis right now where we're separating all the shootings by those that start with a discretionary decision by the officer, pull somebody over for a traffic violation, versus those that don't, with like 911 response calls. And we'll see what the data look like. But most of the police shootings are these kinds of non-discretionary, mandatory responses on the part of officers, okay? And the final thing we can cut out here, is it now about an appropriate time to stop, or what is the time like? Till 2:30. Okay, I think we'll do one more thing then. What this also tells us is that the shootings that we have of what we call unarmed, non-aggressive citizens, the Philandro Castile case, the Amadou Diallo case, and so on, are exceptionally tragic, but they're also very rare, okay? They are not the modal or the most common type of police shooting that we have. Okay. And then actually, I'll skip all this just to get into one last finding that we have, which we've looked at recently, and that's data on the question of officer race. Okay. So one thing that people have wondered, some people have speculated that when it comes to shooting minority citizens, particularly black citizens, that white officers might be more likely to shoot minority citizens than black officers. Okay. Lots of cases of this. In the media, for example, the race of the officer is often mentioned if the officer is white. Okay. On the other hand, people have argued that it isn't about the race of the officer, it's about sort of the institution as a whole, and that officers, you know, we don't distinguish between black or white officers when it comes to these questions, okay? Well, up until last year, we actually were not able to answer the question of whether white officers are more likely than black officers, for example, to shoot minority citizens, because again, there are no databases on this, right? So even when there is a fatal shooting, the local police departments are not required to report the race of the officer to the federal government, right? So we just simply had no data actually on the race of officers involved in these kinds of shootings. Okay? So what we did was we spent 2 years trying to collect all of these data, all right? We looked at every shooting from 2019. So again, that's about 1,000 or so, about 1,100 total shootings. And we contacted every police department that had a fatal shooting in that year. And we got from those police departments, after many, many tries, some police departments were happy to give us the information. Others, it took a lot of effort to get from them. Okay, but we actually got the officer's race, the officer's sex, and the officer's years of experience for every officer that was involved in a fatal police shooting from that department. Okay? And we got about 85% of all officer information, which for these kinds of things is actually very high to be able to get 85% of data from police departments. That doesn't always happen. Okay? And what we were able to do is ask, okay, we have this database of people who were fatally shot, right? We know the race of the people who were fatally shot. And then we could ask, what among those individuals who were fatally shot, okay, what predicted or related to that person's race? So citizen 1 who was shot, let's say they were white, okay, was it more likely that there was a white or black or Hispanic officer on the scene who shot them? Citizen 2 was black. Was it more likely that that there was a black or white or Hispanic officer on the scene who shot them, and so on? Okay. Okay, we can skip that question. What we found actually when we looked at that was that the race of the police officer actually did not relate to the race of the citizen shot. Okay? So it was not the case that white officers were more likely to shoot black citizens, to fatally shoot black citizens, than black officers were. In fact, at just a pure relationship level, it was actually the case that black officers were more likely to have shot black citizens, but that was simply due to the demographics of a county. Okay? So in a county with a lot of black citizens, you're going to have a county with a lot of black officers, okay? Because officers are drawn from the communities that they serve. Okay? Once you control for that, there's no relationship between the race of the police officer and the race of the citizen who is shot. Okay? In contrast, what we did find, and again, this is consistent with what we saw in the other work that I just presented, is that local or county level crime rates predicted the race of a person shot in that county, okay, and predicted it quite strongly. So the greater number of crimes, for instance, that were committed by whites in a county made it more likely that a person who was fatally shot by the police was white. Okay? The greater number of crimes committed by black citizens in a county made it more likely that a black citizen was shot. And again, in this data set, we expanded it to Hispanic citizens as well. The greater number of crimes committed by Hispanics in a county, the more likely it was that a person who was Hispanic was shot, or the person who was shot was Hispanic. Okay? So again, this gives further support to the idea that violent crime is really the context of fatal shootings, and that that's an important thing that we have to consider when we're looking at policing behavior. And then I actually will stop it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people have about the work or anything that we covered. So thank you very much for the time.